Good afternoon and welcome to the discussion program on the book, India's Foreign Policy in the Post-COVID World Through the Eyes of Indian Diplomat. This afternoon, we are joined by a very highly distinguished panel of speakers. The session will be moderated by Ambassador Surendra Kumar, who is also the editor of the book. A historian by education and a poet, Ambassador Surendra Kumar joined Indian Foreign Service in 1972. He was India's ambassador to Libya, Mozambique, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Eritrea, and High Commissioner of India to Kenya, Swaziland, and Malta, and has also been India's permanent representative to UNEP and UN Habitat. Ambassador Surendra Kumar has formed an Indo-American Friendship Association in 2010 and has organized over 120 panel discussions that include over 30 discussions at India International Center also. With these few words, I request Ambassador Surendra Kumar to take the discussions forward. Over to you.
Many thanks, Dr. Munshi, for your kind words and for all your help to make this virtual discussion happen. I must also welcome and thank all the distinguished panelists and all those who have taken trouble of logging on. All the speakers this afternoon need no introduction. They are celebrities in their own right. You read their byline, you read their op-ed, and you see many of them, most of them on television channels. However, let me say a couple of lines about each of them. Ambassador Shamsaran. Sham is an old friend and a neighbor. We often run into each other during our evening walk and exchange notes about the breaking news of the day. He served as India's Foreign Secretary and as a special envoy Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh on nuclear affairs and climate change. He was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board and RIS. Currently, he is senior fellow at the CPR and he is a life trustee of IIC. In spite of all the business attacks by some of our own tribe, he remains one of India's most respected strategic thinkers. His book, How India Sees the World, had received rave reviews. Ambassador Jayant Prasad. Jayant is arguably the most informed and balanced observer of developments of Afghanistan. Besides Afghanistan, he has also served as India's ambassador to Algeria and Nepal. Post-retirement, he served as the DG IDSA. Ambassador Manjeev Puri. Once upon a time, when I was serving as India's High Commissioner in Nairobi, Manjeev used to come to attend UN conferences and environment. He stepped the big shoes of his own father in Belgium, his ambassador to Belgium and the EU, and also served as ambassador to Nepal. He writes for various publications. Ambassador Gurjeet has left footprints on 3 continents. He was India's ambassador to Indonesia, Ethiopia, and Germany. He has just come out with his book on Africa, The Rambi Factor. He was the first to send his contribution to this much earlier than anybody else. He writes extensively and comments on TV channels. Vishwasini Haider. She is the national editor, diplomatic editor of The Hindu. Millions of Indians have watched her on TV show and her show Worldview and found it interesting and informative. Though her critics call her left liberal, I find her balanced objective. I once jokingly told her that she is the female Shah Rukh Khan of the Indian journalism. I still hold that view. Dr. Manoj Joshi. Till recently, I didn't know that he holds a PhD, that too on India-US relations. I have been reading his incisive, outspoken columns with great interest. He is presently a distinguished fellow at the ORF. Let me also say a few words on India's foreign policy before I request the panelists to share their thoughts. Contrary to many commentators, I feel an objective and holistic view would suggest that India has done reasonably well in foreign policy, given the challenging circumstances. Yes, the relations with China are tense, and relations with Pakistan are limbo. The graph of relations with Nepal goes up and down depending on the internal domestic strife in China's lengthening shadows. The relations with Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives are better than earlier. Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan has led to spike attacks in J&K, but we are trying to reach out to the Afghan people through humanitarian aid. Notwithstanding serious differences on some issues, including SA-400, relations with the US have been transformed beyond recognition. It emerged as the largest investor, largest trading partner, and the largest source of advanced technology. And defense cooperation has grown exponentially. There is greater convergence on Indo-Pacific, Quad West, and addressing climate change and terrorism. Though recent Russian approach to Afghanistan and Pakistan causes some concern, Russia remains the largest source of our defense imports. The supply of SA-400 and the manufacture of assault rifle and export of BrahMos missiles have deepened our relations. India has to do a tightrope walk between the US and Russia on Ukraine. Though FTA with the UAE is still not in sight, PM Modi has developed close relations with France, Germany, and reached out to UK after Brexit. India has undertaken the most extensive outreach in Africa. The total number of visits from India at the level of President, Vice President, Prime Minister, and the visits from African heads of state in the last 7 years is higher than the total number of such visits last 50 years. Opening of 18 new diplomatic missions in Africa says it all. PM Modi's foreign policy has drawn maximum dividend in the Gulf region. The relations with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman are warmer. Their criticism of the changes in J&K were, unlike Malaysia and Turkey, muted, and OIC's invitations to Somasaras were unprecedented. Relations with Mexico, Brazil, Argentina are close. In our effort to come closer to Mercosur members will bear fruit. PM Modi tries out-of-box diplomacy, inviting all the SAARC head of state government for inaugural 2014, inviting all the Asian heads of the state as chief guests on Republic Day parade for 2020, inviting all the heads of the state of Central Asian republics on the Republic Day this year, holding informal summit with his Chinese counterpart Wuhan, Mamallapuram, and dropping by Lahore in December 2015 to wish happy birthday anniversary for example of such daring experiments. They didn't produce the desired result, but none should belittle the efforts. I applaud these endeavors, and I always believe it's better to have tried and failed than not to have tried at all. And he is a darling of the Indian diaspora. I am not sure if the UPA government would have handled the Galwan Valley crisis and the relations with Pakistan much differently. In the last 2 years, the world has seen unprecedented deaths, devastation, destruction. Economies have collapsed, millions have lost jobs, airlines, hospitality giants have gone bankrupt. Incursion in Galwan Valley, collapse of government in Kabul, increasing assertiveness and aggressiveness of China, hyperactivity in Indo-Pacific, Quad, AUKUS, Quad West, climate change and continuing threats of terrorism warranted a relook at India's foreign policy in the post-COVID world. Hence this book. 30 contributing ambassadors, including 3 foreign secretaries, 5 former secretaries, chairman of the NSBA, the CIC, and the DG, make this book special. I will stop here, and I invite the senior most person in the end, but today I will request Shyam Saran to do the honor. Shyam, I have read your article, World Around the Corner, of great interest. You have given so much of thought for food. You are talking about Black Swan. You talk about how to anticipate risk and identify opportunity. You talk about international embrace, globalization is integral to technological transformation, new national study, and how the definition of national interest, national security have changed. And you have given new template and how we should work in silos and not follow China blindly. To what ends, I have just 2 basic small questions. You said South Asian economic integration led by India. Now, given the dismal performance of SAARC in the last 25 years, are you really very optimistic that the integration can take place under India when we know that except Bhutan, India, all the countries are somehow related to BRI of China today? Second is this great asymmetry with China you have mentioned, which is a fact. China on all the economic parameters is almost 5 times bigger than India. So do you think in 10, 15 years, we can really bridge this gap? Over to you, you can touch any other issue so long as you use 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Surinder. And of course, even the two issues that you have posed to me probably require another volume like the one which you have edited. But let me be very disciplined and use my 8 minutes to basically focus on the two issues that you have raised, and both those issues are important. So I will take off from a position that I have articulated a number of times in the past, and I continue to articulate it. That is, if India cannot get its periphery right, if India does not get its neighborhood right, then the possibility of India being able to play a much more active role, a more optimal role, both regionally in Asia as well as globally, is not possible. So I think we have to take that as a given, that getting the neighborhood right, managing the neighborhood right, that is something which is absolutely indispensable to any kind of a role for India, both regionally as well as globally. If that is a contention which is accepted, then we have to see, okay, what are the assets we have in being able to manage our periphery well, and what are some of the liabilities that we have. And in terms of assets, I believe that with regard to the neighborhood, what is often stated as a liability for India, which is that India is today the largest country in South Asia. And if you look at in terms of economic capabilities, in terms of military capabilities, technological capabilities, in all those respects, India is much larger than all its neighbors put together. So I consider this not really as a liability, but I consider it as an asset, because it is possible for a dynamic economy like India to be able to become the engine of growth for the whole region. But that means that India should be much better connected with its neighborhood, that India should offer open access to all its neighbors as far as its economy is concerned, become the kind of engine of growth and prosperity for the region. All this is possible precisely because India is very large. Because if you open up your entire market to whatever your neighbors can produce and sell, it would still be a small fraction of the Indian market. Secondly, in terms of connectivity, you should become the preferred transit country for all your neighbors. All your neighbors have borders with you, but they don't have borders with each other, at least as far as land borders. So you are the natural transit country. So it should be possible for you to emerge as the transit country of choice for all your neighbors, so that, for example, if you have a container which has to be transported from Dhaka to, say, Islamabad, it doesn't have to go first to Chittagong, then right around the Indian Peninsula, land in Karachi, then again be transshipped to Islamabad, taking a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks, and huge costs involved. It makes a trade, regional trade, uneconomical. So India can actually play a very, very important role by becoming, as I said, a transit country of choice, because one of the big assets that the region has vis-a-vis others is the asset of proximity. Greater connectivity and a software of connectivity which allows smooth movement of goods and peoples across borders. This is something which will make inter-regional trade within the subcontinent something which is very not only viable, but in fact can flourish. So this is one way of looking at how, in fact, India, the question that you asked, can India lead South Asia? Yes, I believe India can lead South Asia. It has other assets, cultural affinity, which China does not enjoy with this particular region, very strong cultural affinity. These are all assets. So that is with regard to South Asia. It doesn't always have to be SAARC, but SAARC is the existing platform which is available to you. So why not utilize that platform rather than keep looking for something else? With regard to the other aspect which you mentioned, this was with respect to, the asymmetry between India and China. So here I would like to say that, yes, China is 5 times today the size of India. Yes, the asymmetry between the two sides in terms of economic power, in terms of military power, even technological power seems to be expanding rather than shrinking. India, I believe, is the only country which in terms of its size, its population, its very demonstrated capabilities, at least in some areas of science and technology, the fact that it is one of the strongest military powers in the world, despite the fact that it is not quite in the same league as China. But it is a country which, yes, I would say a country to be reckoned with. So if there is any country which has the potential to, in fact, match China, and I would say even surpass China, I certainly believe that it is only India. Now, with respect to what India can do in the current asymmetry, I go back to my experience, and I have mentioned this before also. I go back to my experience as Foreign Secretary during the period 2004 to 2006. But actually, the period I'm talking about is a little longer than that. It ends with about 2007. What is different about that period? Different about that period was that despite the fact that we were still not quite in the same league as China, but we were growing at a faster rate than China. We were growing at the rate of, 8 to 9%. Even people were talking about, 10% rate of growth was possible. India was being cited as a possible new China, the next China, in terms of its commercial and economic opportunity, a country which was developing its capabilities, military capabilities very rapidly. So what was different at that time was that India, though behind China, was seen as shrinking the gap with China. And that opened up huge diplomatic options for us, a lot of strategic space for us. And I truly believe that something like a landmark, agreement like the Indo-US nuclear deal would not have been possible. For example, in the current situation where there is that asymmetry. So we were able to leverage that in order to emerge as one of the most important countries in the world. And so if you look at, say, climate change negotiations, then Manjeev would, testify to that. If you look at our role at, say, Copenhagen, ultimately, the Copenhagen Accord, no matter how much you belittle it, the fact is that it was actually negotiated in a small room between the President of the United States and the emerging 4 emerging economies. So our diplomatic space, as I said, also expanded. What changed was that in 2007, after the global financial and economic crisis, 2 things happened. One, the asymmetry between US and China started shrinking. That is the one side of the story. And the other side of the story is that the asymmetry between India and China started expanding. So we are in that change kind of situation today. Therefore, our diplomatic options have somewhat got limited. So the first order of business in terms of dealing with this challenge is, one, that you get your economic story right. Unless you become one of the fastest growing economies in the world, 8%, 9%, maybe 10% growth, which I believe we certainly have the potential to achieve. That is something which will not immediately shrink the asymmetry, but it will certainly begin to shrink it. And that itself will be a major thing. And the second thing is, do what we are doing, which is to do external balancing by, strengthening our partnerships with those who also share our concerns about a more assertive China that you said, a more aggressive China. These 2 things have to go together. But bottom line for me is, the first part is much more important, what you do internally, rather than second part. Last point I would like to add, on top of all this, unless you are a united India, unless you have a country which is not politically fragmented, socially getting divisive, it is very difficult, even if you had the economic and military capabilities, to really face the challenges which are before us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Saran. We hope we remain united. We hope the North Bloc, South Bloc, Uddhavan all have to get the economy right, and all your hopes about South Asia under India to progress come true. I turn to Jayant. Jayant, you have been one of the most knowledgeable person on Afghanistan since you finished your article. Tell us, I'm sure the people attending, they will be more interested in knowing what has happened in Afghanistan after that. What is the internal situation today? How is the international community addressing Afghanistan, and what are the stakes for India? We have sent 50,000 metric tons of wheat, but more than that, I mean, all these since August last year, what has happened?
Thank you, Surinder. When I first wrote this piece at the end of July, things were very different. Then I revised it on the 30th of August. And you are very right in pointing out that much has changed since then. So today we are a day short of Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. So 6 months short. 6 months will be tomorrow. You know, between the 9th of August and the 15th of August, when the Taliban rolled into Kabul, Nimroz fell on the 9th. And in 6 days, the whole of the Afghan forces collapsed, the government collapsed, the president fled the country. But US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which took place at that time, was written on the wall since the signing of the Doha Agreement in February 2020. Actually, the Americans had embraced an exit strategy in December 2009 under President Obama, when he announced that starting from 2011, American forces will be slowly withdrawn from Afghanistan. And that is the time when he told the Afghan leadership that dealing with the Taliban was no longer an American responsibility. It was left to the Afghans to deal with the Taliban. But the Afghans could not deal with the Taliban for a variety of reasons. And we don't have time to go into all that. But, you know, reasons such as that you cannot control terrorism and insurgency in any part of the world with a foreign force. That Afghans were never empowered enough to deal with their problems themselves. Other people were dealing with their problems. That contractors' profits and consultants' fees took away much of the aid. But the most important reason, which a friend of mine recently, he was a former ambassador in New Delhi, Masood Khalili, who nearly died in the bombing which killed Ahmad Shah Massoud 2 days before 9/11. He told BBC in an interview that for the last 20 years, the Western Alliance, the ISAF forces, the US forces, they were battling or fighting a smoke, not the fire. And the fire was coming from across Afghanistan's borders. And so long as you have support and sustenance to an insurgency in the contiguity, you cannot control the situation. So what has India's engagement in the past been, and how can we make out what to do in the future? You see, India got involved in Afghanistan for the same reason as the rest of the international community. We wanted to prevent it from becoming a safe haven for terrorists. In 1998, in reprisal of the East Africa bombings, when the Americans sent cruise missiles to Jawhar Khel near Khost to kill Osama bin Laden, all that they managed to target were terrorists being trained to fight in India. And this is testified in all the accounts which came out of what happened and who were in the camp, including the autobiography of Bill Clinton, who was president at that time. So India's short-term objective and long-term objective were quite distinct. The short-term objective was to get Afghans to stand on their feet and take their own decisions. And we were confident that if they were enabled to do so, our strategic interests would be protected. In the long term, we hoped, but nothing happened in the last 20 years, that Afghanistan will become a bridge between Central Asia and South Asia.
Tell us more about what has happened in the last 6 months.
Last 6 months, what has happened is quite a lot of unraveling is taking place, and a lot of fault lines have developed, which we are not paying enough attention to. But these fault lines are going to mature only in some time, and the time is indeterminate. The first fault line is that between the two conjoined twins, Afghanistan and Pakistan. The fault lines of the Durand Line and the TTP. There are many in Afghanistan, including among the Taliban, who believe that the area up to the Indus River is legitimately theirs, and the British took it away and made it part of British India and later of Pakistan. So there have been firings and skirmishes at the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, resulting in deaths in the last 3 weeks. And TTP is a big problem for Pakistan because TTP supports the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they say that if there can be an Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan, why not in Pakistan? After all, Pakistan was set up to provide a homeland for the Muslims in South Asia. So these are two fault lines concerning Pakistan. Within Afghanistan, of course, there are other fault lines developing. There is the problem of the lack of human rights, the absence of inclusivity in government, the reprisals which are taking place selectively, and the resistance not just of the National Resistance Force, which is now mostly outside Afghanistan, but of women still demonstrating till yesterday on the streets of Kabul, for which the regime is trying to discipline them. But within the Taliban also there is a fault line developing. There is an old fault line which we were able to see already between the Haqqani network and Mullah Baradar, the Kandahar group. But now there are two more fault lines. One is between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns in the Taliban. And Makhdoom Alam, who was instrumental in the capture of the 7 northern Afghan provinces, even before the fall of Nimroz on the 7th of August, he has been arrested by the Taliban, which has led to huge amount of protest and rioting in Myanmar and also in some other provinces. And this shows that there are tensions in the Taliban camp between the Pashtuns and the non-Pashtuns. And finally, there is a tension between the Taliban which fought in Afghanistan and the Taliban which came from Pakistan, including Haqqanis and the others. For example, the two people who are important were first made in August itself, the acting defense and interior ministers. They were Abdul Qayyum Zakir and Sadr Ibrahim. But when the full cabinet was formed, they were dropped. But they are so important that they had to be re-inducted on the 21st of September as deputy ministers. So in Afghanistan, a lot of things are happening below the surface, which are not visible to us because we don't have any reporting out of Afghanistan.
Okay.
Now, the last point.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do about it? What can India do about it? attitude should be to respond creatively in providing one of the four things we were doing. We were doing humanitarian assistance, we were doing infrastructure projects, we were doing short gestation, small development projects, and we were doing human resource development. But now we can only do humanitarian aid. For that, some amount of contact with the Taliban government would be required. But we should not recognize that government because we have to first hold them accountable to the commitments that they have made, which are encapsulated in the Security Council resolution adopted when we were presiding over the Security Council, the resolution 2593. And finally, while mindful of the limitations imposed by our not being present in Afghanistan and not having contiguity with Afghanistan, I think we must continue to support the Afghan people by providing humanitarian assistance, which we are doing, but also providing medical visas, student visas, and so on. And we need forceful diplomacy, finally, to connect with Afghanistan's other major regional stakeholders, because just Pakistan alone cannot solve Afghanistan's problems.
Okay. Thank you, Jen, for this update. Very useful. Now I turn to Manjeev. Manjeev, you have written a very nice piece on India relations with EU, and also have mentioned that most of the EU leaders feel they don't know what India stands for, what are they doing. But because time is limited, I think I will again ask you to tell us, how is EU reacting to the Ukraine crisis? We have so much of diplomacy, and the French president is going, and you have the German chancellor going, and there's a lot of, because their interests are not identical to American interests. They are more concerned, more nervous about what will happen than this. Other is that in spite of this hump, you can call it, in May 21, when we have virtual summit with all the EU leaders, with Prime Minister Modi, has there been a much further deployment, any chances of signing of the long pending this trade investment agreement? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Surendra Kumar, and thank you for inviting me and also inviting me to write for your book. Sir, you have linked me umbilically with the European Union. Thank you very much for that. But did you know that your panel today is absolutely unique? 2 out of 3 members of the Indian Foreign Service who served in the same post where their father served as ambassadors are sitting. And that's Jayant and me. Sir, incidentally, you didn't ask me who's the third person, so I'll tell you. It's Chitra Narayan and Kyan Narayan, by the way. Okay. Sir, you also asked me to speak on Europe, etc. So I'll touch upon Ukraine for a minute. But let me say that, you know, that Ambassador Shyam Saran was my foreign secretary. I obviously have to agree with him with everything. And I do so happily, I must tell you this. Sir, I'd just like to add 1 or 2 small points to what you said. One, India, you know, has always looked beyond its periphery. This is something that Ambassador Jayant Prasad drilled into me very nicely at a lunch recently. And so they've always thought of themselves, or we've always thought of ourselves as a world rather than just the region. Having said this, the importance of the region should never be underestimated. We've all heard Bangladesh going places. Let me tell you, even Nepal, which we consider just going here and there, if you just go there and try and figure out, there are such tectonic changes which are taking place, which are affecting mindsets of people. And it is we who need to understand, because it's everything for us to lose. No one else has much to lose on this matter. This is one of the things. The other point I want to make to you is a very big point for India. Sir, almost nobody in the Indian Foreign Service focuses on a simple fact that by the year 2027 or 2030 at the latest, India will be the largest country in the world. And by the year 2040, in all probability, the 3rd largest economy in the world. So do you realize what it means? Today, I think I can ask a question. Do you think every child anywhere in the world who goes to school knows about India? I don't think we can say yes. But does every child know about China? The answer is yes. So you will enter the geography lessons. Please understand, therefore, the need for India to put these two aggregates together and therefore use this to leverage its place in the global order. The manifest destiny is there for us, but we need to play these cards together. And I, of course, completely agree that it all fundamentally boils down to one factor. For a large economy, large aggregate, and that is economy. Let's be crystal clear about it. You have the money, there are many things that you can do. When you don't, and we saw what happened in COVID too, then many things go the other way around. Sir, let me answer your second question first. The EU is perhaps the best example. And I know we have Gurjeet there, he was ambassador to Germany. But we in India need to understand that the Europeans realized after the Second World War, not just that the Americans put them together as a bulwark against the Russian, but they realized they were now diminished. But how could they retain their position of a kind of preeminence despite the diminution? And they came up with this construct. The construct may be diminishing, it may be having its problems, but what a nice way by which they continue to remain the world's second largest economy, by far the second largest economy. The United States is $21 trillion. The EU, even after Britain, is $18 trillion. We are not in that game. And this is something when we realize vis-a-vis the European Union, we're very good. They've been there, done it, they know what they want. And they have a lot of options. And options for us for economic development are not that many. As of now, with your own association and everything, we've almost put ourselves in one basket. It is particularly important for us to push this. So you mentioned the bilateral trade and investment agreement. We've now decided that we'll try and do it in two parts. But fundamentally speaking, sir, the answer to that lies in a political push. It won't happen. It just won't happen. Bureaucracy will keep making the figures. But if you want a tectonic change in the Indian economy, let's be clear. Whether Europe is diminishing, whether it's going and it's not going. In fact, if it's going, all the more better for us to take what they've got. Today, you wanted COVID vaccines. Where did they come from? AstraZeneca came from where? Where did the Pfizer vaccine come from? I'm just giving you the most top of the mind example. It is a powerhouse of money, a powerhouse of technology, and by far the world's global standard setter. And it suits India well. Please take it. It will bring about a sea change in the Indian economy, and we need it. I'll leave another word with you. We are now focusing on Atmanirbhar. I think it's important to make clear to the world that this doesn't mean protectionism. This is how it gets read in the rest of the world. You know what is happening with all the bilateral trade treaties, arbitration, etc. Sir, India actually needs a huge leg up. And in my opinion, there is no better player than the European Union for doing this. Of course, they need to be assured that the options that India possibility holds for them would become available to them. But this is a game that you need to play. But a game in which I would say if they are diminishing, an even better possibility for us, but we must push. Now coming to Ukraine. Sir, let's be quite clear. The United States sits an Atlantic Ocean away from Europe, or at least certainly more than an Atlantic Ocean away from Ukraine. The Russians may be having their own interests. Putin may be playing his own game, etc. But do you think any European country, maybe Malta or Spain or Portugal may not be affected, but do you think France, do you think Germany, etc., would not be badly impacted if something terrible happened in the case of Ukraine? So look at their interests. Their interests are different. American interests. I mean, after they started all this, and it didn't begin today. It started in 2014. I think many people here would know who was the American ambassador in Ukraine. They would all know him from India. I don't want to tell you about all this. But the nature of the game is old Cold War business, hegemony, trying to extend yourself. This is exactly what is happening. Is the world going to be benefited? I don't know. But I am very, very cautious and apprehensive of one thing. Even though we are far away, we don't have a dog in the game, as they say, but still, collateral damage could be tremendous as far as we are concerned. Not just that the eye on the ball of the Americans moves from China, B, There are strong and stringent sanctions on Russia, which impact not only arms imports that we do, but energy interaction with Russia, which is important. And thirdly, if all of this happens and Europe faces a tremendous energy crunch, the United States would be hard-pressed to find answers. And if they do find answers, we would again become major victims because our major suppliers would be forced to supply petroleum and hydrocarbons in the much more important ally as all this is concerned. I'll just speak for 1 or 2 more minutes. I believe as far as Europe is concerned, we need to focus on economics, be particularly focused on it. We also need to understand this construct called the European Union. Much of the activities that European countries do in other countries, and India is perhaps the best example, is for the countries to do. So when the Rafale gets sold, yes, there is a certain amount of clapping in Europe, but it's a French problem or it's a French game. When you want to do anything in Europe, let me tell you, and Gurjeet is there, we always, we are 20 years behind the Chinese in understanding all these things. That you should get France and Germany and you'll get anything in Europe. You get nothing. They are a necessary condition. If France and Germany say no, you'll get nothing in the European Union. But if they say yes, there is no chance you will get anything, you have to get the Commission and the entire country. If we want to be big global players, sir, we have to be players on the continent of Europe also, and in terms of these bilateral movements. So therefore, the European Commission becomes important. The entire climate debate, which country is pulling anything? They are pulling within a certain limits, but the debate gets pulled in a centralized manner. And this is something that we in India particularly need to understand. I know we have an old colonial legacy. The British High Commissioner looms large. All European ambassadors loom large because they give us visas. I understand all that. But the man who calls the shots as far as Europe is concerned are not their bosses. India is the only country where every day there are articles on what the French presidency of the European Union means nothing. The man who calls the shots is Charles Michel. Mr. Francois Macron has a 6-month rotating presidency handling some residual issue. The point is to try and understand this and get to the meat of it, that an interaction and a far closer interaction with the European Union would be of tremendous benefit to India economically and take us to places which would bring about a game-changing element in terms of where we are in the global pecking order and what we would be able to thereafter do this. And lastly, a simple point, sir. Let's stop listening a little bit less as far as Europe is concerned to those who, like you and me, speak the English language. They have a vested interest. They've always had a vested interest. And I'm saying this very simply in this August gathering of those who are experts. But the fact of the matter is, when every day you look at the newspaper from the United States or from Great Britain, sir, the ideas that you get are their ideas. They're not ideas which are good for you. Let me stop here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeev. You have been very candid and frank as usual. Now I will turn to Gurjeet. I have read your piece. It's very comprehensive, very informative, and you have given so much of new information. Now I have been impressed by 2-3 your very profound comment. You say many of ASEAN leaders say that we see too much of China and too little of India. And you also had somebody commented that, look, Indians are now the big project and they never get finished. We keep on hearing about trilateral, whatever goes on for 1 decade, 2 decades, 2.5. But tell me, because the time is limited, let me pick your brains on how is the current ASEAN attitude to China? I feel they are ambivalent. China is their largest trading partner. They had problem what I told disputes and all. At the same time, they cannot really be totally on the side of US. US has its own vested interest, and they want US to be there so that China is not bullying, but at the same time, they don't want to antagonize China. And also, ASEAN is not monolith. Like some countries like Cambodia or Laos and Singapore, Vietnam, they're different views. Other is how has been the progress on this our announcement of Sagar and IPOI? Has there been much headway on this? And last is you have talked about Japan is trying to put together RCEP, TTP, NAFTA together, and we are not member of any of these. So we are really not a player. And how do you get into some kind of association that we really draw benefit from that? Over to you, Gurjeet.
Thank you, sir. I've heard with rapt attention all my predecessors. So let me move to an area which is only 3 trillion GDP, but 10 countries in ASEAN and beyond, if you look into East Asia, much bigger. But unlike Europe, this area has now become strategically very important to us. And we can't do to ASEAN what position we are currently taking on Ukraine. We can't do that from India. So I think that is where, when you look back at how the LEP and the AEP need to reformulate, I think that's where you have to understand that you can't let the iron grow into you. You have to exhibit it. Second thing is, every country today is reformulating its strategic responses. And today they are not uniform. So to say that ASEAN is ambivalent to China, I don't think is correct. ASEAN, kowtows to China in almost everything. They have let go of all the 9-9 islands which China wanted. China and ASEAN are mutually the top trading partners. That thanks to the pandemic, China is the biggest supplier of pandemic succor to ASEAN. But yet, what ASEAN is apprehensive about is being dragged into a Sino-US rivalry. That is anathema to them. They don't want to touch that with a barge. So even if they have to give up their islands, they are not going to suck up to the United States. But that does not mean that there is not space for others. And in my chapter, I think I have said that Quad members should actually work with ASEAN countries, some ASEAN countries, for ASEAN plus policies which are trilateral. And I'll give you 2 possible examples. There's a nascent India, Australia, Indonesia trilateral, and there should be a Japan, Vietnam, India trilateral. You see, on its own, India's trade was about $97 billion at best in 2018-19 with the whole of ASEAN. Since then, it has fallen, I think, to 79 billion. Now, all the benefits of the ASEAN-India trade FDA, which was concluded in 2007, have been tarnished by non-tariff barriers in which ASEAN countries are very smart, much smarter than us. So simply doing it by ourselves, whether it is trade or it is investment or it is supply chains, is not a feasible alternative anymore. The Chinese are sprawling everywhere. They keep you out. Chinese have got about 50 DRI projects in ASEAN countries. And India struggles to have its $1 billion line of credit to ASEAN extended in 2015 to be used. I mean, there is the power equation. We have to bring in our economic might much more. The potential has to become real. Now, you mentioned, sir, about the Kaladan and this, the trilateral highway. I mean, these have been going on embarrassingly long. They never seem to see the end of the day. So I don't know what to say about them. And ASEAN interlocutors have stopped asking me, when will this end? So evidently, there is a gap in India's abilities to complete its projects. I ask you, why are we building the trilateral highway? Because unless the northeast of India becomes a manufacturing hub, which perhaps with the help of Japan and the northeast forum we made, you are not going to have exportable surpluses. The trilateral highway will essentially channel Chinese goods through Thailand and Myanmar into India. And now we are thinking of taking it further into Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. I frankly don't see the logic. To my mind, a better opportunity in parallel to the trilateral highway would be to link the Mysuru, Bengaluru, Chennai industrial corridor with a sea route to ASEAN. We have already talked about a Chennai-Vladivostok link, which we think is our effort to get Russia involved in the Indo-Pacific. If you bring this in along with ASEAN, I think it will be a new India, ASEAN, Russia paradigm, which, well, Chinese don't think that the ASEAN want to challenge them. And the ASEAN will not say we are challenging them, but they will look forward to opportunities. Ramos is one such example. How over years Vietnam, Indonesia were interested, but today Philippines takes the march over them and goes. So it shows that India is losing its hesitancy, and the ASEAN countries are willing to use what we call strategic autonomy, critics call sitting on the fence, to, at least in defense, look for alternate sources, where America, India, and others remain important. Now, one factor I think is that ASEAN is dependent on the APT, what they call ASEAN +3, China, Korea, and Japan. Now, we tend to believe that we are competing with those three, and I think that is the wrong approach. I think in every way, either we build partnerships with Korea and Japan to work with ASEAN, or we tell ASEAN, we are not those three. You have to deal with us on a different level of partnership. Why do I say this? Because in the case of the India ASEAN Fund, it is entirely paid for by India since I think 2005. I think in 2022, the year of friendship means shake hands and you put in some money too. And let us also decide what projects will be done. The situation is we put in the money, ASEAN 10, India 1, 11 countries decide what to do. This is not, and is not working to our advantage. We have pumped in so much grant money into Myanmar, which is valid, into Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Okay, Vietnam, valid. But Laos and Cambodia, I think it is the law of diminishing returns. We have no economic access into those countries. And this is where I think what the Singapore former secretary says, that, you know, within ASEAN, we need to pick and choose now. Stop trying to deal with ASEAN as a whole. And I think within ASEAN itself, they have also junked this consensus concept. If you see how ASEAN reacts to Myanmar, they are not taking a consensus of all 10. They are going along. And when Cambodia as chair tries to reverse that, they boycott the meeting with the Cambodia. So this thing about some people in ASEAN doing what is right, we need to associate with some in ASEAN to do what is right for us. Now, finally, what I would like to say that we need to work with China, not China, Japan and Korea and Australia to build better supply chains with ASEAN. Now, here what is happening is in the SCRI between India, Japan, and Australia, we are resisting Japanese efforts to include ASEAN because we think they are more competitive than us and will suck away the Japanese investment which would otherwise come to India. At the same time, we have a free trade agreement with ASEAN, which is best utilized by Korean and Japanese companies in India. They are the best users. So they are the basis of further supply chains with ASEAN. Australia still has to work that out. I'm not quite sure what we can do with it. So while the northeast of India has the potential to link you with ASEAN, that seems to have been a long time in the oven. I think along with that, building the sea route, linking the Mysuru, Chennai industrial corridor with possibilities in ASEAN and link it further to Vladivostok and Japan is a much better alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gurjeet. We are running a little behind time. Let me first show this is the book, and these are the people who have contributed. Now, after the 4 ambassadors, and including me, we are all vested interest because we have also contributed. We turn to 2 friends who are not part of the book, who can be more objective. I will first turn to Manoj and then to Swasini. Both of you have read the entire book from cover to cover. Now, Manoj, I will like you to comment on the book as a whole, not only these 4 people who have spoken today, because read the book, and this book is not one author book. We have a 30 different perspectives. Over to you, Dr. Manoj Joshi.
Thank you, Ambassador. I was actually making it a point to speak overall on the foreign policy and comment on the book and comment on the book. So
whatever you do in 8 minutes.
yes. I've just started my stopwatch. Okay. So after the fiasco of Eastern Ladakh last year and the deadly second wave of COVID in 2021, the government seems to have pulled up its socks. Till February 2020, when Trump came to India, there was still a touch of tamasha in our foreign policy. You're all foreign policy people. I know what you know what I mean. But COVID seems to have brought some degree of sobriety. Though, of course, we were trying to use the vaccine to boost our foreign policy, which brought disaster. That the January to April 2021, 70 million doses were exported. And at that time, I don't know how many million died, because the economists estimate that 2.3 million people had died by May 1, 2021. That's their estimate. But of course, foreign policy, as the essays in the book suggest, is more than pandemics, more than prime ministerial visits and summits. It requires considerable conceptualization and the ability to translate the ideas to the ground with skill in a competitive environment where others are also seeking to do the same. So what have I seen since in the past year? I've seen more purposeful and realistic foreign policy, deepening of the ties with Quad, something which has been clarified by the emergence of AUKUS. Because we know that security is taken care of by AUKUS, so Quad is a different animal. Credit must go to Jaishankar for sidestepping the US agenda of using Quad as an anti-China grouping. Number two, the West Asian outreach of the new Quad. That's another significant Israel, UAE, US, and India. Even though the goals of this are not really clear as of now, it does represent a foreign policy which is being played on the front foot. Number three, the improvement of ties with Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives. But here, as Ranjan Mathai has pointed out in the book, we are discussing what in Ambassador Surendra Kumar's book, that strategic patience has paid off to some degree. Number four, realistic handling of the Myanmar coup. Number five, active participation in the SCO. Number six, outreach in Central Asia and a realistic approach to Afghanistan. I'm just listing out the thing. Number seven, efforts to have FTA with UK, Canada, UAE, resumption of negotiations with EU. Now, Modi government had cancelled 70 FTAs and had signed none so far, and had declined to join the RCEP, which links nearly all East and Southeast Asian countries. All these things about ASEAN, whatever it is, I mean, we have to understand the role that these FTAs will play. Now, of course, the problem areas still remain: Pakistan, China, Iran, and of course, in a sense, the US itself. These are critical areas which play spoiler in ties with South Asian neighbors and Central Asia. Now, when it comes to global developments, I think the strengthening of the China-Russia alliance, the standoff over Ukraine, which could paradoxically, even now, yield an agreement. We don't know, there can still be an agreement between the West and Russia, has implications for ties with Russian ties with China. Meaning, if a last-minute agreement does come out, which every day, every moment things are happening there. Then as far as Iran is concerned, the possibility of a revival of some form of JCPOA could throw Iran into the geopolitical equation. If the US manages that trick, you can have a sudden twist of the game. Now, looking at the rest of this year, the problem areas, Pakistan, China, Iran, remain. A breakdown in Ukraine, as has been pointed out, has huge negative consequences for us. We may be compelled to choose between Russia and the US and deal with a much more dangerous Russia-China entente, if that happens. On a longer perspective, India needs to get onto the point where our natural preeminence in South Asia, and I think this point has been made, that unless and until we are able to assert our natural preeminence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, it should shine through. It should shine through. It is not something which we should have been struggling for at this time in 2022. Currently, because we lack economic heft or military clout, our situation depends on who's the leader of a particular country. So when Oli or Khalida Zia are leaders, we have problems. When Deoba and Sheikh Hasina are there, everything seems to be fine. So this is our fate in South Asia. Now, incidentally, of course, from January 1, the RCEP agreement comes into effect. I just wanted to make that point. As for the United States, you know, the problem is that deep political divisions. I'm a specialist on the United States. That's my basic specialization. The deep political divisions there and the dysfunctional politics have implications for the rest of the world, because it's going to make the United States move this way and that way. And we don't even know. This is just the beginning. I would say a return of Trump to the White House, can have all kinds of implications. Now, of course, the book has the book has a range of essays, but these are in areas by many of the top diplomats. Many of them I know personally. The problem is it is simply not possible in this time frame to do justice to go into individual essays, But in a sense, the tone of the book has been set by the essays of two of the stars of the Foreign Service, which is former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran and former NSA Shiv Shankar Menon, because their approach has been an overarching approach. So I'm able to approach that, deal with it. Both provide a larger picture of the foreign and security policy arena. Not surprisingly, given the COVID pandemic, in his essay, Shyam Saran has warned about the future of black swan events arising from possible climate or cyber-related issues. He could also very well have added the so-called grey rhino developments, arising from a crash into issues which are obvious before us. The one of the things is the lack of one of the obvious grey rhinos, which we confront, is the lack of a national strategy, national security strategy, or a national strategy which can enable us to make an informed choice. The other is the persistence of a development path which is simply not sustainable. I think Shyam Saran makes that point that you can't have that kind of development path which has been followed by the United States and these countries. Shankar Menon has made the important point that there is indeed no external existential threat to India. Whether it is China or Pakistan or a combination of the two, they can at best, he says, divert and delay us, but they can be managed. Internal security is the most important here. And here the trend is that while separatist and terrorist violence has in fact declined, we now face the challenge of communal violence and individual general breakdown of crime, like rape and assault. Shankar's second important point is that in the process of dealing with external threats, it has led the country to periodically reform its and upgrade its defense and security policies. But when it comes to internal security, the key area of policing has been largely unreformed. No police reforms have taken place, people shouting from the rooftops, nothing happens. His bottom line is that the foreign policy of the future is for the need of a South Asian region to respond to its growing centrality in today's geopolitical environment. Again, this point has been made that India needs to be the leader in South Asia. I was with Vajpayee ji in 2004, January, when in Islamabad, the motion on SAFTA was adopted. And it was quite a heady thing, that South Asian free trade area by 2014. But what has happened? Nothing has happened. And we embedded our Pakistan policy into that SAFTA idea. That the whole India-Pakistan agreement also took place around that same time. So we can't afford to be, we need to be the leaders of the region, because only then can we play a role outside the region, once we are able to consolidate that. This, of course, implies a very heavy responsibility on India. Indeed, it should be a mission to consolidate Indian primacy in the South Asian region, which in my opinion should be the immediate target of India's foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Joshi, you have done well. Now I turn to Suhasini Haidar. Having been diplomatic editor for so long and having conducted your show Worldview for so many years, I think you are the right person to comment on a book by Diplomats. Over to you, Suhasini.
Thank you, although I can see, Ambassador Kumar, that there are no questions left really to answer, as so many of this distinguished panel have looked at.
We still have time for questions. You go ahead with your 8 minutes.
All right. So I mean, I would come to it pretty much as Manoj has, with the idea that this is a very comprehensive work. And if you were to ask me,
we should see Suhasini's face rather than Dr. Joshi's face now.
If you were to ask me as a diplomatic a journalist, but not just a diplomatic journalist, but somebody who's really followed Indian foreign policy for as long as I can remember, and you were to say, what is it that you would like to read? I honestly could not come up with a better collation of writings about every part of the world, but more importantly, written by the very people that I think I would like to hear from, because they approach the relations not just as, in terms of their experience of the relationship, which is very important, but also with the idea that they are votaries of better ties. So it's a very different perspective than the perspective, say, a journalist or a research analyst or someone else would give. So it's almost an affectionate look at the ties, but one which conveys the kind of proximity that each of these distinguished diplomats have had when they're talking about the relationship. So I think the first thing I'd say about the book is that it could not be bettered on when it comes to the choice of the subject or the choice of the authors of each of them. I think what's also important is that each of the authors is very engaged with the present. And so how the relationship with a certain part of the world deals with today's big challenges. And those challenges are set out, of course, firstly in the title of the book, which is how is India going to deal with this post-COVID world, but also very specifically with how you're going to deal with a world that is increasingly transactional, increasingly interest-aligned based, as well as the idea that it is getting so polarized that you now are going to be left with only making choices, whether it is between Russia and the US or the Western forces, whether the idea that Russia and China coming together means India has to move a different side, even the idea of economic coalitions that the book handles from so many different points of view. You know, there's a former Secretary ER who's just retired. There's also each ambassador has dealt with the economic relationship, which I think really brings, it's one of the great strengths of this book, is the amount of economic information that is carried in each of those. The focus on the neighborhood, I could not have asked for more. The idea that while you look at every other part of the region in a certain way, the neighborhood has not been made one subject, because that's normally my quarrel with a lot of writing that tends to look at India's relations with its 7 neighbors in some kind of a singular prism, which of course is possible, but it also takes away from each of those relationships. So really thank you for putting together each of the high commissioners, and there are too many to mention, but the idea of reading Ambassador Raghavan on Pakistan, or Ambassador Jain Prasad on Afghanistan, or Dev Mukherjee on Bangladesh, or Ranjit, it just, and Ambassador Haran on Bhutan, which, brings out a very different perspective than the one you would read normally in what we read on a daily basis. Ambassador Surinder Kumar's particular essay on soft power diplomacy, I think, is very, very interesting and pertinent, particularly the point he makes that this was not invented today. That in fact, India's soft power predates Joseph Nye's idea of it and has its own image in the world. And this is something people really do forget, that if India was, as so many of our ambassadors have said, if India did punch above its weight in a sense, or take an interest of beyond its boundaries, or be a world of its own in that sense, it was able to do it only on the power of its soft power. That's what really actually was the engine for India to be able to do that, the kind of goodwill that every Indian and every Indian diplomat as a result has faced, no matter which capital they go to, and received, I should say. The other thing, and I'm afraid it did come as a surprise to me, is that each of the essays is very simply written. It's not written in diplomatese. It's not written in equivocating or making, using very, very large words. So it is something that I think many would read as a very simple message from the elders, in a sense. And I do hope that that is how the book is taken, not just by students, whom I know will be interested in each of the essays, but also by practitioners above all. And this is where I'm going to come into the ideas that I think the book could have benefited from. The essays are really unified by the author's idea of India. And that's what makes it really interesting to me, that each of them is coming to it from different angles, but their common idea of India, of an India that is standing independently in the world, that has even if you don't want to use the word non-aligned, but has an independent voice of sovereignty in the world, is an exemplar of pluralistic, inclusive, humanistic kind of behavior that India projects in the world, and not one that rejects its past, but grows from it. And each of the essays, therefore, look at the history of it. I do think that the book could have benefited from a little more look inwards, because today more and more foreign policy in India, and more time for our diplomats, as well as the MEA, South Bloc, and the rest, is being spent by what is happening internally in India, whether it is the polarization between religious communities, whether it is the kind of reactions internationally that India's diplomats have to deal with when it comes to the treatment of protesters, or the treatment of a certain community, the reactions to various events like the Article 370, and what it did in terms of diplomacy, and what it did in terms of what our diplomats now have to do, which they didn't perhaps have to deal with before. Perhaps it's just a factor of the kind of globalization. But each time India reacts strongly to international events, and conversely reacts strongly to international reactions to domestic events, these are now areas where the Foreign Office is more and more involved. I think also the impact in that same vein of domestic economic policies like the Atmanirbhar. Manoj Joshi spoke about the refusal earlier to even be part of the RCEP, to sign any new FTAs, because FTAs were seen as the problem, and the new kind of explanation in between. So these all become very difficult for they become challenges for diplomats to deal with when politics, in a sense, becomes personalized, and as a result, what we see as Indian foreign policy in one great continuum tends to see sudden jerks that it falls to our diplomats to deal with. But overall, thank you so much for including me in this panel, and thank you for producing a book which I think is going to be not just a wonderful read, but also a reference for students of Indian foreign policy.
Thank you very much. It has been worthwhile to have you on the panel to say all nice things. Now, listen, you talked about, we do write about internal developments. Shyam does very often. I also do occasionally. Well, we have not put on this book. And when we do know what treatment we get, as Shyam got it, I mean, we are open to those, but we try to. Now, we have very limited time for questions. I see here there is one question from somebody called Dinesh Pathak. Now, he says, rise of hostile Sino-Pak axis is the new prime threat to India's security. What should be India's strategy of dealing with it, considering Biden administration already has the comfort of distance on Afghanistan? I will request, I think, Shyam, would you mind to comment, because you have more experience than any one of us.
Certainly, I think the observation is quite apt that if there are two major adversaries whom we are confronting, they would be China and Pakistan, and the fact also that they are perhaps far more aligned or allied with one another than they have ever been before, and that, of course, confronts us with what may be called a collusive kind of a threat. But I would say that India's response, a very fundamental principle of diplomacy is that, try and avoid having to fight on two fronts. That is very, a major principle. Second, you concentrate on the major threat and try to neutralize as much as possible the lesser threat. And in that respect, despite whatever issues that divide India and Pakistan, I think managing an adversarial relationship with Pakistan, you are in a better position because power-wise you are in a better position. Therefore, how we contain the hostility with Pakistan within certain sort of limits, so that we have a little more room for maneuver vis-a-vis China. I think that is something that we should certainly be looking at. Even though we may have to hold our nose, how do we, engage with Pakistan, keep a dialogue process, going, and try to see whether it is possible to contain the adversarial relationship, the scope of the adversarial relationship within limits, so that, as I said, we have greater room for maneuver vis-a-vis China. And the other aspect, of course, is that coming to what we have been talking about, there is no escape from putting really the maximum focus on getting our economy into a high growth path. That is something which is absolutely critical. And added to that, something that Suhasini said should have been also a focus of the book, which is that how we are seen abroad and our credibility, amongst external actors is very much related to what is happening inside the country. So if India is seen by outside actors as a country which is divided, as a country where there is social conflict taking place, as a country where, there is so much preoccupation with internal, issues, it will be regarded as being less of an actor outside. I mean, we talked about, the United States. Manoj said that one of the most important things that we have to look at is the polarization within the United States itself and the uncertainty that creates. Well, you can say the same thing about India, that the polarization that is taking place in India, the communal kind of situation that has arisen and continues to become worse and worse as time goes on. This is something which, whether we like it or not, is going to impact on the manner in which we deal with the Chinese threat, in the manner in which we deal with Pakistan. So that's really the observation I wanted to make.
Okay, I have a few minutes left before we really leave the limit given by Dr. Munshi. I think there is one question on which I will request all the panelists can really comment in whatever way they want to. There is somebody, Mr. V.N. Dalmia says, I read an interesting piece by Raja Mohan, which postulated that China will only support Russia so long as it's expedient, and China won't be pleased at all if Russia invades Ukraine. What are the views of panelists? Okay, so I invite all of you can chip in, but you try to finish in maybe 3 minutes or so. So start Shyam, then everybody can, this is one subject where everybody can give comments.
China may have taken a gamble that Russia will not actually, invade. But even if it does invade, If I look back upon what happened after the occupation, the invasion and occupation of Crimea, maybe China may not be happy, but I think there are bigger stakes involved in terms of its, competition with particularly the United States of America. So I do not see a conflict with Ukraine as something which will derail the Sino-Russian relationship. And if it does happen, China itself is self to blame. Why did you sign a joint statement which basically gives a blank check to the Russians?
Okay, Jen, there's the former DGIDSA. Your comment in 30 seconds. 1 minute.
There will not be a divergence between Russia and China at the present moment, given the larger stakes that they both confront. So look at how China reacted to the Kazakh problem when the CSTO forces went there. China was supportive of Russia, and China believes that Russia has legitimate interests in its periphery. So the other factor is that a successful Russian foray in Ukraine might encourage actually the Chinese to ponder the question of what they should do about Taiwan. So that is a danger signal. That's all I have to say.
Okay, now Manjeev and Gurjeet, both of you have been in Europe. So, okay, go one by one, Manjeev, and then Gurjeet.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, let's try and understand this. I don't think the Chinese won't be generally supportive of Russia, but why should Russia necessarily mount a very largish attack on Ukraine? I am not sure about this. I also think that please read some of the statements which have been coming out today itself, with the Ukrainians themselves stepping forward and making some gestures of openings, like, let's give this NATO a little bit of a break, if that's it. So these are factors that need to be understood. It is my feeling that the Chinese are playing for much bigger game than just friendship for Russia. And consequently, they won't like that derailment to be a repeat of what COVID did for them, their decision or their desire to be at the top of the global order.
Okay, Gurjeet.
Okay, very briefly, I think the new German government is caught in a cleft stick. I think they were preparing on how to deal with China in view of America-China relations, and now they have to deal with Russia in view of America-Russia relations. And I don't think they were quite prepared for it. However, I think both Anna Baerbock and Olaf Scholz are stepping up to the game. But you can see that when Scholz was in Washington and Biden said that, if the Russians don't behave, we will not stop the usage of Nord Stream 2. Scholz was actually silent. He did not assent. Similarly, Anna Baerbock made it very clear to Blinken when she went there that the Europeans want to have their own say on this. And therefore, their Normandy process is what they want to use. Of course, their arms control and all is concerned, the US can keep talking to Russia. But on Ukraine, the Germans and the French prefer to use European instruments because they believe they cannot isolate Russia.
Okay, now Dr. Joshi, the Biden and his Secretary of State keep on issuing warning every day, giving timetable Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. What is your assessment? What's going to happen?
My assessment is, I'll put it the other way around. I think what will happen is that if a deal takes place, that could derail the China-Russia friendship. Meaning, if a deal takes place, but on the other hand, if there is an invasion, the Chinese are not going to be happy for the simple reason 2022 is a year they want everything to be stable and calm, because this is the year of the Party Congress. They don't want something which is going to disrupt the economy, which is going to disrupt global order, which will inevitably have an impact on the way their outlook in the world. So I don't think so. I agree with Sham that I think they calculated that the Russians will not invade. I also think they will not invade. I think there will be a deal at the last minute.
Okay, Swasini, where do you stand? They will or they will not?
No, I do think Dalmia ji's question is very important because it is putting a spotlight on what is the United States actually doing. The United States has, in several of its assessments of threat perceptions and its defense strategy, has said its two biggest challenges are from Russia and China. Today, the US is telling us that they would actually like to prize China away from Russia, not the other way around. Certainly, that is not something that India feels is in its interest. We might be interested in prizing Russia away from China, but not the other way around. I think the real problem is that we are working ourselves into this kind of worldview now, which necessarily pits Russia, China, and anyone who stands with it, whether it's Iran, whether it's Central Asia, whether it is even countries like North Korea and all the rest, against the rest of the US allies, whether it is in Europe, whether it is Australia or Japan. And I think this is a dangerous place for the world to go. Some of our speakers spoke about how ASEAN does not want to be caught in this constant kind of polarization and constant having to choose between the two. And I think everyone is making a mistake if they think China and Russia are not learning these lessons. They are not looking at the situation and saying, hey, I'd like to make my partner a little more responsible or to do this, that, or the other. Instead, they're looking at it in its entirety. What the US has done in the 6 years that followed Crimea, not really been very effective. What the US has done with Afghanistan, where they promised us and so many others that they would never allow the Taliban to take Kabul by force. But in fact, it may not have been with shots fired, but the Taliban took Kabul by the power of the gun. And the US did nothing to stop that. In terms of what the US or its allies and people who stand up for the democratic world order have done with Myanmar, we have our own relationship with Myanmar. But what this group has done with Myanmar is essentially 1 year later, you see the junta very much in control. You don't see their sanctions really having much effect. And I think we really need to start thinking once again about what kind of world order we are going to have, what kind of leverage we can use on these so-called rogue states that might actually work. By polarizing the UN Security Council, by polarizing the world and telling every country, including India, that you've got to choose between me and the other, whether it's on S-400 or anything else. I don't think the US and the West is doing anyone favors. And to have this kind of dream that somehow you are going to prize Russia and China apart, when actually you are the single force pushing them together, is again, I think, a slightly false dream.
Okay, thank you very much. The world around the corner, Shyam. We hope this world around the corner will be brighter and better for us. Thank you all. You all have been very generous with your time, generous with your comments. I think we have a discussion which has been worthwhile without the book. So thank you very much. And I thank IIC, I thank the director, Mr. Srivastav, and also Dr. Munshi for all the help, assistance, and the technical team. And thank you and good evening or good night.
Okay, thank you.